Okay, good morning, everyone. It is 11:30. We would like to welcome you to our Coalition for Strong Nebraska Speed Advocacy webinar. This is our final webinar of the fall 2017 season, so thank you so much for joining us along the way. If you are dialed in on your phone, please mute your phone by pressing *6, and then to unmute your phone, press #6. You might see in the bottom right corner of your screen a chat box. If you have a question during our webinar, please use the chat box, and we will be able to pause and ask our presenter a question. If you'd like to ask a verbal question, please look at the top of your screen where you see a little person that looks like she is raising her hand. So you can just click that, the drop down, and then you'll be able to ask a verbal question once we unmute your line. Um, so let's go ahead and get started. We have a fantastic presenter today. I'm so excited. Um, so, so Tyler Richard is the communications director at the ACLU of Nebraska. Got a lot of just in all things communication. And we'll talk a little bit about writing effective letters to the editor and opinion pieces in the newspaper and how those can help shape the debate and make sure your opinions are effectively communicated. So without further ado, Tyler, take it away.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Joe, and thanks to Cami as well for all of your work in arranging today's conversation. I hope that people feel free to ask questions in the chat box throughout the presentation. I much prefer that flow than saving things until the end and maybe not having the context for a question. So please feel free to ask one at any point in time. I'll tell you a little bit, just a very tiny bit about me and the work of the ACLU to get us started, and then dive into first more talking about the reasons why you might want to think about a letter to the editor or an op-ed, and then going into some structures and a fairly simple formula, I think, for putting together a quick but effective letter to the editor that can be used for op-eds as well. So I'll go ahead and dive in by talking a little bit about the ACLU. Most people are probably familiar with the American Civil Liberties Union's work defending rights in courts. Today we're at the U.S. Supreme Court talking about non-discrimination for gay and lesbian couples, LGBT people, the Masterpiece Cake Shop case that we are saying is about more than just cake. It's about people's access to hotel rooms and medical care and all sorts of other things. That's probably the part of the work that people are most familiar with, the work in the courts. But there's a lot of other work that the ACLU does. We empower communities across the country with our Know Your Rights materials and our mobile justice smartphone app that lets people record interactions with law enforcement and send them to the ACLU for review. And then influencing public policy with a powerful voice. This includes our legislative work, where we often work in partnership with the Coalition for a Strong Nebraska and many of the organizations who are coalition members, as well as our work to mobilize the supporters and people impacted by various public policy issues. We have a People Power platform. That's a lot of P letters, a People Power platform that we started in February of this year around immigrants' rights, and we've since expanded that to also work on voting rights issues here in Nebraska, and we've got some other ideas as well. This is a nationwide tool that we're using to make sure that people have a way to organize their neighborhoods and their friends, their families, their coworkers, whoever their constituency may be, on the issues that they care about, not just the issues that are ACLU flagship issues. Moving on a little bit into Tyler, that is an authentic picture of me, and I have to tell you that not a lot has changed since that photo was taken. I'm still on my phone way too much of the time. I still really care about dressing snazzy, and you probably can't see it too well, but on the table back there, there are still Lego sets that are a part of my life. So a lot hasn't changed for me, but many things have since this photo was taken. I've been doing communications-related work for advocacy organizations for about a decade now, first with Planned Parenthood, a brief stint as a freelancer working with political candidates, nonprofit organizations, and government agencies. And now I've been at the ACLU of Nebraska for 7 years, and about half that time, well, I've been doing communications work for all of that time, about half that time as the communications director. So that's enough about me and the ACLU. Let's dive into why you might want to write a letter to the editor or an op-ed. I think it's really important, you know, as a comms person, my first question is almost always audience. Who are we talking to, and why are we talking to them? And for letters to the editor, we have to remember that newspapers tend to be where policymakers and those who care about policy often go first for their information. The general public, we know TV is often the source of news and information, and we shouldn't ignore TV by any means, but for policymakers and people who are already kind of tuned into current events and the thought about the policies and the government bodies that shape our lives, they often go to our newspapers. So it's a way to communicate with not just lawmakers, but the body of people that might be influencing lawmakers and having conversations about the important policy issues that are a part of all of our work. I think it's very important to remember that you should write a letter to the editor not just based on your own organizational priorities, but when is there something going on in the public that you can create a hook to. Well, yes, you can create your own news stories for sure. It is sometimes a much more effective way, a much more effective strategy to tie into something that is already a part of a public conversation. So I put in there a family impacted by a tax proposal. We've probably seen lots of tax proposal conversations lately, both locally and nationally, and that might be a great opportunity to share a story of a family that you might have a really powerful and compelling story, and you may have had that family story with you for months, and now because of the conversation about a tax proposal, that might be the perfect time to elevate that story, that particular story, rather than trying to get attention to it without that context. I think it's also important to think about writing a letter to the editor when you have a story that might be, might flip a narrative. You know, we recently, for the past couple of years, we've often talked about, thought about transgender rights as something that is a kind of urban issue because of how different media stories have been crafted. But for a lot of the work that we do, we like to talk about a farmer from small town Nebraska who happens to be transgender, or someone from the Gering Scottsbluff area who has been a part of our organization's work. And having those stories that kind of challenge a person's idea of who might be impacted by an issue, those tend to really be effective letters to the editor and op-ed. So when you have that kind of unique narrative, that's a great time to think about turning this into a letter to the editor and op-ed. And then the final stuff I want to talk about with when to submit, it's not just enough often to have a valid organizational perspective, because all of our organizational perspectives are valid. But what is something that might not even be a policy issue, but has become a public narrative that your organization can chime in on? I think the very necessary reckoning that we're having with the role of sexual assault and domestic violence in celebrity context, I think that's a great opportunity to think about local DV and ITV, domestic violence and intimate partner violence organizations, to talk about what these issues look like locally, and not just in the celebrity context, but in a much more Nebraska-specific context. The final thing that I want to mention is when to write an op-ed is this record needs to be clarified point. And I'll give you an actual example of this. The ACLU put out a report about the state of incarceration for women in Nebraska, both the prison system and county jails. There were a couple of facilities, including our state prison system, that did not agree with our assessment that there were not quality-free products for women who were menstruating, who needed a tampon or a pad. And we had pushback from those counties, and as well as our State Department of Corrections. And we could have tried to correct the record ourselves based on the policies we had seen and the analysis that we had done. But we thought it was much more effective to have someone who is currently serving time in a correction center to correct the record herself based on her own experience. I think this is probably one of my favorite uses of an op-ed or a letter to the editor, making sure that we have an opportunity to get the record corrected by someone who is really directly impacted by an issue, and not just a policy organization perspective, but using them to get the stories out there of the people who often matter most to our work, those who are going to be benefited or hurt by different policy proposals and decisions. And this kind of goes into the last why thing that I want to share, this quote from Audre Lorde about telling your own stories and defining yourself. I think that's a really great opportunity to use an op-ed or a letter to the editor to give someone an opportunity to define themselves, not just for themselves, but in a much more public context. And I think that when we have these personal stories, we're able to not just influence policymakers and the circle around the policymakers, but go even farther out and impact the hearts and minds of our neighbors and our communities. So I want to pause and see if there are any questions about this kind of when and why to consider an op-ed before I dive into some tips about making an effective op-ed or letter to the editor.
And you would want to push #6 to unmute your line if you have a verbal question, or you can feel free to use the chat box. Tyler, I have one thought. I'm wondering how you determine the difference between when you write a letter to the editor and when you write an op-ed.
Sure. So an op-ed has usually, I think, a couple of context pieces that are different than a letter to the editor, but can apply to letters to the editor as well. Usually it's when you have that real personal story. A letter to the editor can be any person talking about why an issue matters to them, but an op-ed, because it's about twice as long, I think that those are really great opportunities when you have someone who is really impacted by an issue and has that personal, firsthand experience or connection, or someone who can really talk about the journey that they've gone on with an issue. We know in many contexts having someone talk about why they changed their mind on an issue can be really powerful, and so using that in an op-ed. And I think the final thing would be when you have a real expert perspective, someone who from a research or a professional perspective really can dive into the details a little bit more than you could in a letter to the editor. So it's usually, that's all based on kind of the writer and the voice that you have a bit more than the topic. So if you have that kind of person, that kind of voice that can write that op-ed, that's what I would use those for. And just be prepared, know that there are a lot of instances when a newspaper might say, hey, for this to be timely, we need to publish this within 2 days, and we've already got op-eds selected for the next 2 days, so can we turn this piece into a letter to the editor? That's not an uncommon thing to do, but if you have that voice of either personal experience authority or expert authority, I would try to push that more towards an op-ed than a letter to the editor on the first try.
Great, thank you. Any other questions?
Sure. Well, I'll move on to some tips and ideas for thinking about how you formulate a letter to the editor or an op-ed. So first I want to talk just a moment about how people make up their mind. Is it that top image with the graph, or is that bottom image with the conversation around coffee? And the reality is people who are smart in ways that I am not smart have put electrodes on people's brains and discovered that we make a lot of our decisions and form our opinions from a real emotional place. And I'm not suggesting never include data in a letter to the editor or an op-ed, but I'm suggesting that that's probably not how most people are going to make up their mind. And so you might want to think about a way to balance things out in the letter to the editor or the op-ed and make sure that there's a bit of an emotional context. Stories are not just for kids. If you look back at the earliest ways that humans have communicated, there were not cave drawings of charts and numbers. There were cave drawings of stories and people's experiences. And those parts of our brain are still more or less those early mammal reptilian parts of our brain that are making our decisions for us. And so using those stories whenever you can, including in letters to the editor or op-eds, that's what I would suggest you lead with. The formula that I'm going to suggest lets you do this on almost any topic, and both for a letter to the editor or an op-ed relatively simply, quickly, and I also think effectively. And I can't take credit for this particular formula. It's something that I learned from religious organizations that are working on LGBT issues. So the first part is who you are. Then we move to a shared belief or a common value. And finally is the story part, which I'll also call a fact. Let's dive in a little bit. So the who you are portion. This is a connecting you and your experience to a particular issue. So are you speaking because you are a business owner and this issue matters to you as someone who has employees? Are you speaking as a parent? Are you speaking as an educator? This doesn't need to be a statement that is a biography. It can be one line. that connects you to the issue that you're going to be discussing. And it can be as brief or as explicit as you think is appropriate to connect to the issue. I kind of think of it as Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, introducing the people in the neighborhood. You just need that little bit of a connection to the issue in order to have the reader go, oh, this is why I should pay attention to what this person is saying about it. The next thing would be this shared belief or value. And I would encourage people to think about that word belief and consider using that word belief because there's something that lights up in many people's brains when they hear that word. If that's not a comfortable word for you, then don't use it. But if it is a word that's comfortable for you, I would encourage you to consider it. So we've got a little map. Again, can't take credit for this, but this has some of the common American values. And you might, if you have data and research on a particular issue to dive into this a little bit more, definitely do it. But here are some common values that you can think about trying to connect any issue to. And I know that's something that we do in our office with a lot of the issues we work on. How are we might be thinking about an issue from the perspective of which constitutional amendment does it fit under, but what's the value that connects people to that policy, and how do we make this very direct? And then the next portion is the story portion. And here's where you get to use a single statistic if it's relevant and appropriate for your letter or op-ed. But I would also encourage you to consider a personal story. And I'm going to show you how you can use both a statistic and a personal story that might be able to connect and have value. So again, I'm going to go back to that Women in Prison report that we did. This quote says, in case it's a little challenging to read, "I'm a grown woman, but this made me feel as embarrassed about my body as if I was an adolescent all over again." This quote is from an incarcerated woman who is talking to us about her experience of not being able to afford tampons and pads while incarcerated and behind bars. And this is, I think, a very powerful little story because many of us can remember being embarrassed about our bodies when we were adolescents, and it connects with a very common idea that you don't have to be someone who has experience with incarceration to connect to. We can all connect to that statement, regardless of what our background and experience is. And I think it's that kind of, this is a great way of also, I think, going to that common value idea, but I think that this is a fantastic, very short, this is not a long story, but a fantastic quote that we were able to use about the importance of free and low-cost and quality menstrual products for women. But we can talk about this another way, too. We can talk about this in terms of a simple statistic. Tampons in Nebraska's prisons can cost double store prices. This is not a statistic that you need to get out of a calculator or pull out your statistics books from college to understand. It's a simplified way of trying to talk about this issue. And I think you could use either this story or this statistic in a letter to the editor and make it fairly effective and fairly without a lot of words either. One thing that I would encourage you to think about if you're doing an op-ed rather than a letter to the editor, you can think of it more as a little bit of a classic thesis where you have an argument and then a thesis and then three arguments. And you can use, if you're doing an op-ed, particularly if it's from a credible expert, I would encourage you for two of those arguments to feel very okay using a statistic. But even if it's coming from an expert perspective, I would try to save at least one of those three arguments for a story, for something that connects to that other part of the brain. And I should also mention that there are no hard and fast rules for any of these things. If you have four perfect arguments, I would encourage you to use 4 perfect arguments rather than 3, but just know that typical framework is often with a thesis and 3 arguments. So we're approaching the end of our half hour, so I want to move into a couple of final quick tips for y'all. And again, feel free to ask a question at any point in time. For a letter to the editor, I would try to aim for about